All right. Hello. So my name is Spencer Rydman. I have got the first presentation here today, and I am presenting on Jessica Moss's Aristotle's non-trivial, non-insane view that everyone always desires things under the guise of the good. So in this writing, Jessica Moss examines Aristotle's claim that all human desires are for things that are either good or that are thought to be good or held to be good. And he takes an extreme view of this. He claims it's not only the case for higher order rational desires, but for instinctive desires, appetites, things like that, lower order desires. And there are a lot of implications here. One being, it implies that some creatures, which we don't normally consider to be making value judgments about the good, seem to be doing so on account of the fact that they have appetites. We'll see here babies, animals, the acrasics, a group of people. Aristotle, the Greeks categorize these people as being weak-willed. We get the word akrasia from, being weak-willed. There are some contradictions in his claim about the acrasics that are raised, that these exist in Aristotle's past claims about desire, things that he's made about the acrasics that seem to directly contradict what he says here. But Moss attempts to show that Aristotle's view is worth taking seriously without resorting to any kind of deflationary reading of the text, and she makes it clear that she's not arguing that what he's saying is true, just that the argument is worth taking seriously. And so the first objection considered in the writing is one Moss calls the insanity horn of this dilemma or objection. And many think it's true that desiring under a guise of the good presupposes some desire with rational capacity, as they're making value judgments about the objects of their desire. And so the question is, how then can it be the case that animals and acrasics are desiring the apparent good? The case for the acrasics looks especially problematic, like I said earlier, because Aristotle has specifically stated that they desire pleasant things over the things they themselves believe to be good. But if Aristotle insists on the above claim being true about desire, then we are driven to the second horn of the dilemma, which Moss calls the triviality horn. Right? So a defender of Aristotle's extreme form of the good argument has to be meaning nothing more than something B appears good to some person C, or can just B attracts C somehow, right? And this is a claim it's trivial. It doesn't offer any substantive philosophy, right? We don't think it's especially interesting to say something like this. But one may try to escape this by taking a deflationary reading, and this would state that the objects of desire are considered good, maybe for the animal, while not appearing as good per se. And excuse me. This reading, the deflationary reading, is problematic. It seems Aristotle in the text is clearly trying to explain the good as being something more than simply a desired thing, which is desired because it is pleasant, Moss states. Additionally, she argues that this forces the use of sort of a mixed use of the apparent good, right? In a passage from Aristotle, he claims, the object of wish, without qualification and in truth, is the good, but for each person, the apparent good. So the deflationary reading is suspect. It assumes Aristotle is using the same word with very different meanings in different times, which is something we wouldn't expect. And Moss tries to remedy this and maintain that Aristotle's claim about appetite and desire are both stances, and that both are philosophically substantive. And she bases it on a pretty literal interpretation of Aristotle's claim about pleasure, which is that to feel pleasure in something is to perceive good, right? So she claims that the state of perceiving pleasure is a full-on cognitive state, which is the awareness of value. And if it can be shown that Aristotle treats it this way, the way that Moss claims, then the claim can be made that two things can be claimed. One is that things can appear good to creatures entirely independent of any beliefs about goodness, and that experiencing an appearance of something as good is a genuine cognitive state. And these together would free Aristotle from both charges, both the insanity and the triviality objections. So then Moss moves on to talking about pleasure as value perception, right? The claim about pleasure as perception... So the claim about pleasure as perception of the good is based on a passage from Aristotle himself. In fact, to feel pleasure or pain is precisely to be active within the perceptual mean toward the good or bad as such, is what he said. So here Moss takes as such to refer to the good or bad, while she takes the perceptual mean to refer to the faculty of the person themselves. And an explanation follows in the writing after this. So first, we'd consider what it means to be active towards something as good, right? And as Aristotle connects the concepts of good and the end so often, like you see this in the Nicomachean Ethics all the time, he'll even use them interchangeably, right? So Moss takes the word good here to mean an end, or being active towards something as an end. So in this sense, like a sapling, Moss writes, gives this example of a sapling, right, which would draw up water into its roots, and the water is good, as you know, that's the end that promotes the tree's survival. And obviously here there's no higher functioning needed for a good to be perceived in a way. And then animals experience higher forms of these ends and experience mental states in which they pursue and take action to desire them. And in this sense, this is the sense in which the earlier passage refers to the good, right? Sometimes value awareness is delusive. Moss writes, Aristotle claims some people desire bad things knowing they're bad, but he refers to this as like sort of a malfunctioning of the pleasure center, right? And Moss writes, the essence of perceived pleasure should not be based on defective cases, but on cases in which everything goes well. Right? And the function of perceptual pleasure, as a look at the psychological works will show, is precisely to direct the perceiver towards its good. And Aristotle's explanation here is teleological, or based on ends, right? He claims that animals are endowed by nature with perception, so as to meet their goals and survive, whereas like perception is designed to solicit positive or negative emotions when some being comes in contact with some object, and this steers the being towards the beneficial things and away from the harmful things. And so whenever there's perception, then there's pain or there's pleasure, and wherever these are, there is the necessity of appetite, right? Whereas appetite is the desire for the pleasant. And so Moss wants to show that Aristotle holds that appetite is for the apparent good in the robust sense of being for something the agent is in some way aware of as good. And so if feeling pleasure is something, if feeling pleasure in something is legitimately being cognized as good, then Moss has shown what you wanted to show. And that is an important if there. And so far, Moss has done well to defend against the insanity objection, since if it is the case that perceptual pleasure, if it counts as finding the good, it requires no cognitive sophistication. Animals can do it just fine. Babies can do it just fine. Right? And the case of the acratics may still be troubling, and it's important to mention that Aristotle conceived of the perceiving and reasoning parts of the soul as being separate. Moss writes, the acratic agent rationally judges some tempting object bad, and thus forms a deliberated desire to avoid it, but the object appears good to her perspective soul, and so she appetitively desired it. At this point, what's left of the triviality claim, right? It may be the case that it's been made worse, right? Because it's possible that this notion of value perception can exist without any appeals to cognition that Mauss makes. But Mauss claims that when a creature comes in contact with something good for it, that is cognizing, right? That's all you need for it to be cognizing. But a deflationist, again, would want to argue with this and would state that, when a slug, the example given in the writing is when a slug tastes a leaf in the jungle and its mouth gets this sort of a special tingle, it's because it's been designed to behave in a way that achieves these things that are beneficial to it. But in the end, the slug is only tasting the leaf's taste, right? It's not tasting the goodness of the leaf. And in this sense, one might argue Aristotle's talk of the pleasant is just a metaphor. But Mauss gives us several reasons for rejecting this, right? So firstly, she appeals to the function of perceptual pleasure in referring to cognition only as meaning, a state is cognitive on this use, just in case it is a creature's way of discerning or discriminating some property. The fact that a thing is beneficial to a creature in this way is an objective but agent-relative fact about the thing, right? Is an objective fact about it. And at that point, in feeling pleasure, a being is registering a fact about the object, namely that it is beneficial. That's fully cognitive. And so that's the first reason. She gives us a second reason to consider pleasure as genuine cognition. And she appeals to something Aristotle calls pleasure, or Aristotle calls pleasure an activity of the perceptive mean. And just the wording there strongly implies that it's a perceptive faculty, right? The perceptive mean referring to a genuine perceptive faculty. And Aristotle himself has referred to pleasure itself as a form of perception in some passages. And so the simple argument in support of this claim references the modum animalium. And this gives an example where being perceives in the avoidance of pain, the body parts around the heart will change, right? So like the muscles around the heart will change. They'll get hotter or cooler depending on if it's pain or suffering. And this is unique to the feelings of pleasant or painful perception. And as perception results when some object strikes a sensory organ, the organ reacts and causes others to react as well. And as the reactions we see in the heart are unique to pleasure and pain, Mauss says there is an intrinsic difference between the perceptual system and its activities on occasions when there is no pleasure and on occasions where there is. And so when a person experiences pleasure or pain, ultimately they're reacting in a way that's unique compared to how they would act without it, right? So Mauss sums it up as, the second reason she sums it up as, is an exercise of the perceptual system qua perceptive. There is a third reading she gives in the writing. She doesn't go into it very much, states that it's sort of long-winded, really complex, and not enough room to write about it. Simply put, though, the main idea is that it refers to the fact that Aristotle claims that perceptual pleasure forms the basis for a thought with regard to goodness. And so that's what I have for the main paper. I do have some questions here that I have a question I was wondering about. And let's see. Here it is. So what I was thinking when I was reading this, I had a question with regard to Mauss's definition of cognition, right, or cognitive. She uses it as a stand-in for Aristotle's kritikon, and these are faculties which discern, distinguish, or judge, is how they're defined. And Mauss then claims that her use of cognitive carries no implication for anything conceptual, rational, propositional, or doxastic. So my question is this, right? Is it possible that someone could raise an objection to this notion where that, like, if critica are faculties by which we judge, discern, and distinguish, is it potentially impossible for the term to carry no implications about anything conceptual, rational, propositional, or doxastic? Because it seems to me that by judging, discerning, distinguishing at all, these are inherently conceptual, like at the very least, and they also definitely seem to be rational and propositional in a sense, right? Even if it's only self-propositional. And if this is the case, does this have any effect on Mauss's argument and our use of the word cognitive? Does it change it at all? Is this sort of just a semantic thing? I think it would be interesting to look into. I feel like it might have some impact that we could look at. And then, so that's sort of an analytical question I had. And then I had one more question. I don't know if the class watches this, but if the class does watch this, just a simple thing I was wondering, do you think it's true that people always desire things or only desire things that either are good or appear good? Like, is it the case that, could we ever find a counterexample whereas a person is desiring a thing that isn't good and that they know isn't good and they desire anyway, whereas they're truly desiring it because it's not good, like, and not desiring a bad thing instrumentally because they think it'll have some better end? Do you think any cases like that exist? I don't know. I can't think of any. It strikes me as a no because just off the top of my head. But that's what I got. I hope I summed it up well. I hope something could be learned from this. I thought it was a really hard reading. So I did my best, and I'm sorry if the video is a little long. I feel like I still didn't do justice to all the good content in there. But I hope you like it, and thank you.